Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we're discussing Game 47 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the Edmonton Oilers, in which the Sharks have lost 3-0. So it's been almost 2 weeks since the last San Jose Sharks game, and so it was a major question of how the San Jose Sharks would actually look coming into this one. There were a couple of options. The first one was we'd end up seeing a well-rested Sharks team who have their legs under them and end up skating circles around the Edmonton Oilers. The other option is that we'd get a bit of a rusty San Jose Sharks team who would take a few minutes, maybe a period, to shake off the cobwebs and would maybe not be able to get this victory against the Edmonton Oilers. But instead, we actually ended up with the third option, which was that the Sharks just came in looking completely awful, playing one of their worst games of the season and showing absolutely zero motivation in this game and dropping it 3-0 in shutout fashion, which is pretty crazy because not only did they have this almost 2-week break, but this is now essentially marking the de facto halfway point of the NHL season. Obviously slightly more than halfway through, but still 46 games. You got 36 games remaining on the schedule. The Sharks at the beginning of the break were only a couple spots out of the playoffs, only a couple teams in front of them, and now they find themselves many teams in front of them because many teams had to make up some of those games in hand and have been able to win them. And so you would expect the Sharks to have some sort of motivation coming into this game, and yet there was absolutely none of that. Well, I shouldn't say none of that because this game actually started off rather well for the Sharks. The first 6 minutes was controlled pretty heavily by San Jose, and so it looked like they were going to be that well-rested team coming in and they'd be able to abuse that fact over the Oilers. But it would take a pretty set of lucky bounces for the Oilers that would get them the first goal of this game that would just tip the Sharks off completely, and suddenly they'd go from looking like a team that came out quite strong to looking like a team that doesn't even belong at the NHL level. They would eventually give up a second goal also on a pretty lucky deflection, but the luck really didn't end up mattering in this game, and so they'd be behind 2-0 at the end of the first period. The second period was just downright embarrassing for the San Jose Sharks. They managed just 2 shots in that period, and that was a period that they even had a power play in. By the way, their power play was quite disappointing here tonight, but you have a power play in a period and you only end up getting 2 shots. That is just unacceptable at the NHL level, and as such the Sharks trail 2-0 at the end of 40 minutes. Going into the third period, are you expecting the San Jose Sharks to come up with a big response, for a fire to be lit under them and they'd come out flying and maybe trying to get this goal that would get them to within 1? Well, that didn't end up happening, as in the first couple of minutes it was actually the Oilers who were absolutely dominating play. McDavid on the ice, he gets about 3 high danger chances before he ends up scoring on a pretty low danger chance, though I definitely don't blame James Reimer for that. Reimer was the only Sharks player who was really doing much of anything in this game. He was the only reason that this game that ended 3-0 wasn't something like 5-0, 6-0, I would say. And so McDavid ends up scoring 3-0 for the Edmonton Oilers, and then they just keep getting chances, Reimer having to make some good saves. And this is not to say that the Sharks had absolutely 0 chances throughout this game. I will say that Stuart Skinner, the Oilers goaltender here tonight, did play a pretty solid game. In fact, if both goaltenders had been rather average, maybe this game ends 5-1, 5-2 could be a bit of a stretch because there were some decent chances early on and also at times in that third period, but realistically the Sharks absolutely do not deserve even a single point here tonight. And if you were expecting the Sharks to come out here at the de facto halfway mark of this season and try and aggressively make that playoff push, well, that does not end up starting here tonight. Just an embarrassing game against a division rival who they would be chasing in that playoff race, a 3-0 loss. On to the players to talk about. There really isn't much to say, as none of these players really stood out in any sort of positive way, but I will say at the very least that the first line for the San Jose Sharks was the only one that was even semi-redeemable. Meyer, Hurdle, and Barabanov were the line that were getting the majority of the very few and far between chances that the Sharks ended up having, which was nice to see. When it comes to Timo Meier, there was that undisciplined play that he had in the second period, though upon sort of further review, I'm not entirely sure how fully undisciplined it was. He ends up taking this tripping penalty, and then he takes what looked to be an extremely aggressive slash onto Connor McDavid, and you're thinking, oh, he's probably just extremely angry from having gotten called for the tripping penalty, that he comes down really hard on McDavid's stick. But what it kind of looked like to me in the end was that he trips the Oilers player, and then kind of thinks that the whistle has gone and that the play was dead, and when he realizes that it's still going and that suddenly he still has to actually defend, he ends up coming down way too hard in a sort of instant reaction onto McDavid's stick, trying to make that defensive play. So I would say slightly more credit, I guess, goes towards Timo Meier, but still unacceptable that you take 2 penalties on the exact same play. And I wouldn't say that really burned the Sharks throughout this game, because they ended up losing 3-0 in essentially every facet, but still something to mention for sure. But generally the first line was definitely the Sharks' best, though that's not saying much. With the second line, there was that very early chance for Jonathan Dahlen in this game where he gets robbed by Skinner for the Edmonton Oilers, but otherwise we didn't necessarily see much of anything from the second line. Couture didn't really do anything. Balcers ended up getting injured near the end of the second period. He blocked a shot with his back, which must have stinged significantly. Did not end up returning for the third period. I suspect this isn't going to be any sort of long-term injury. I would not be surprised to see him back for the next game, especially since the Sharks do have a couple of days off before then. But just to mention that he did not play the rest of that game. On the third line, we had Nieto, Bonino, and Cogliano, still not really doing much of anything. We're caught in the defensive zone a lot, but at the very least, unlike in previous games where I have said that was the case for this third line, they're not really alone in that particular world, I would say. It was pretty much every single line for the Sharks were caught in the defensive zone, so they don't necessarily stick out as much. And when it comes to the fourth line, of course, basically nothing to say here about this invisible fourth line. I think the major question we do have to ask ourselves is, what exactly does the family tree of Lane Peterson look like, and where is exactly Bob Booner when it comes to that family tree? Or maybe are their moms friends? Do they go to the same book club or something? Because that must be the only possible explanation for why Lane Peterson continues to not only find himself on this fourth line game in and game out, but even so find himself on the second power play unit. A struggling second power play unit continues to feature a player who does not even have a goal on the year for the San Jose Sharks in a pretty large handful of games. Should the Sharks play Rudolph Balcers on the power play? No. That second line player for the Sharks, he doesn't get to touch the power play with a 10-foot pole, but Lane Peterson, the fourth liner with 0 goals, yeah, let's keep giving him that ice time in that particular role. Maybe the Sharks would actually have more success on the power play playing their best players in that particular area. But on to the defense to talk about. We have Brent Burns and Mario Ferraro, and no player was able to use, or should have been able to use, the rest better than Brent Burns. The Sharks had that back-to-back game right before this massive break against the Hurricanes and the Florida Panthers, in which Brent Burns played a very, very long time, over 60 minutes combined in those 2 games. So Brent Burns, absolutely, with the injury to Erik Karlsson, needed this time to rest, and so I expected him to be at the very least better here tonight, but that didn't necessarily end up being the case. He had a couple of nice stick plays, but generally seemed pretty bad in the defensive zone, along with his defensive partner Mario Ferraro. So generally not a very good game here for this first pairing for the San Jose Sharks. However, that's not necessarily saying all that much, because generally this was not a particularly good game for any of these defensive pairings. A lot of them having issues getting the puck out of the zone. And that's exactly the issue that you have when you play 5 or 4, maybe 5, depending on how much you count Mario Ferraro in this particular area. When you play defense first type of defenseman and not really those puck moving defensemen who can get the puck out of the zone. You can say what you want about Ryan Merkley when it comes to actively defending in the defensive zone, but when it comes to getting pucks out, when he has the puck on his stick and making the first pass to get the puck out of the zone, Ryan Merkley was one of the better defensemen for the San Jose Sharks in that particular area, at times even looking at better than Brent Burns in that particular area, and he's now not in the lineup, and so we have to right now sit and watch players like Vlasic, Shemek, Milosh, Middleton all try to get these pucks out of the zone when they don't necessarily have that skill set in their toolbox. One of the reasons why the Middleton-Erik Karlsson pairing worked so significantly well is because Karlsson and Middleton complemented each other very strongly. Middleton is not the best player when it comes to getting pucks and carrying pucks out of the zone, but Erik Karlsson excels in that particular area. So Middleton just feeds the puck to Karlsson and he does all the work there. When you're playing with Nick Milosh, who is no better than Middleton when it comes to that particular area of play, you're kind of in an issue where nobody from on the back line is clearing the puck out. But moving on to the goaltender, like I said, James Reimer was really the only player who was actually good here tonight. Certainly did all he possibly could to keep the Sharks alive, but he would have had to limit the Oilers to a grand total of 0 goals, and with some of the lucky bounces the Oilers had in that first period, that was essentially impossible. And so Reimer given absolutely no aid here tonight. He tried his best, just doesn't get any offensive help. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Thursday, where they will take on the Vancouver Canucks, another team who are in the intense Pacific Division playoff race for the San Jose Sharks. So if they actually want to try and push for this playoff spot, which you wouldn't really get that idea from the game here tonight against the Edmonton Oilers, but if they want to do that, that needs to happen with a victory against Vancouver. Class dismissed.